For everyone with an interest in MASH or more broadly, steatotic liver disease, Surf's Up. Season 5, Episode 13 of Surfing the MASH Tsunami, the first part of our rolling preview of the Global Liver Institute's Global Fatty Liver Day 2024, starts now.
This week on Surfing the MASH Tsunami.
In order for us to truly holistically attack this disease, we need to move on from just having one medication for one aspect of the disease state in one country and begin to really screen people to be able to address the issues that lay before us in terms of patient access and kind of set the ground, if you will, for other countries and other at-risk populations. So this year, Global Fatty Liver Day, go get screened.
One of my real concerns is that patients will get activated into a system that isn't ready to absorb them, and that will present a ton of its own challenges.
But as GPs hear more people say, I think I might want to be screened for this, I've got type 2 diabetes, I've got hypertension, I've got high cholesterol, then they might start to go, well, we'll start to ask those questions. So chicken egg scenario in some extent.
What scares me, Louise, is where do we start? You know, it's easy to do something small. It's hard to do something, as Jeff said, you got the whole ocean. Like we're all like looking at each other and going, okay, so like who's going first?
And what you and Louise and Michael are saying here are vast. It implies that there is awareness of the liver, there's awareness of liver health, it implies there's awareness of liver disease and downstream effects, it implies that there's awareness of screening. There are just so many good things that grow out of that, you know? So let's get screened and then for providers, rule the liver out.
Every week, a global community of steatotic liver disease stakeholders comes together to explore the most critical challenges in diagnosing, treating, and developing medications for patients with MASLD and MASH. Join liver health advocate Louise Campbell, pricing and forecasting guru Roger Green, and this week's guests, Global Liver Institute Vice President of Liver Programs Jeff McIntyre, and Fatty Liver Alliance founder and President Mike Betel, as they look forward to Global Fatty Liver Day, which falls on June 13th this year, this week on Surfing the MASH Tsunami.
Remember to stay tuned after this episode for this week's question of the week.
So it's only been 6 days actually, since we recorded our last episode, but it feels like the world has changed. The evening after we recorded the episode, we heard the sad news that our co-founder and co-host and colleague, Dr. Stephen Harrison, had passed away suddenly early last week. If you are on LinkedIn, if you are on Facebook, if you are anywhere in social media, you'll see hundreds, maybe thousands of tributes pouring in through the week from all over the world and all different kinds of people. And I will be talking a little bit more at the end of this episode in our business report about the tribute that we plan to start for Stephen on this episode next week. But right now, we're here to talk about something more promising, which is Global Fatty Liver Day on June 13th, 2024. Jeff McIntyre is here. Mike Betel is here. Louise is here. I'm here. And this will be the first conversation we have about this. We will also be inserting individual interviews with folks out in different countries or parts of the world about what they're doing as part of the day as we move forward. That'll be coordinated activity that you'll hear in the middle of the week. Sometimes you'll just find an extra episode pop in or a conversation, and that's what it'll be. To get started, though, before we go to typical Groundbreaker, I would just like to take a minute and ask each of you to share a memory of Stephen. I didn't prepare anybody to do this, so take a minute and think about it.
Roger, I'll jump in because he has been on my mind and in my heart since the news last week. It was a heavy week, I feel like. And I feel fortunate to have entered the liver field at a time when I had the opportunity to have dinner with Stephen, to have a couple of appearances here on the podcast with him, to be able to talk with him and be on a few panels that he moderated as well. As you know, he's former military. I kind of got to know him as my father, who was former military, although of a very different generation, was in his final years. And so I felt like there was a little bit more than a professional bond with Stephen on this. And Dr. Harrison and I were able to kind of talk about and share some inside humor on stuff. Notably at the Liver Forum, I think there were some inside jokes we were able to share on one of the panels that no one else seemed to be able to pick up on. But I think one of the things about Stephen, I mean, his professional legacy is going to be with us for a long, long time. But one of the things that really struck with me is in the midst of all of our professional discussions about non-invasives and getting into the drug development process and clinical trials and all this very technical stuff. He was the one person that as a Southerner I could count on to come back with some pithy little West, Texas saying that would absolutely level the playing field for me and suddenly be like, I get it. And I think it was on this podcast actually where, I'm sure I was in deep into a soliloquy on the need for patient involvement and this or that, and, had been shortchanged by this system or that system. And I remember verbatim, Stephen's reaction was, well, the butter slides off all our biscuits every now and then. And it just absolutely was, foremost, I thought, I'm stealing that. And it just absolutely was such a kind of humble and humbling sort of turn of phrase that his Texas demeanor, I think, often got lost in some of these conversations. And I just kind of reflect on, in that it really, to me, represented the whole man, if you will. And it's certainly a great loss.
I think that's a great story and a great comment. And for those who are not familiar with American regional patois, you will note that as soon as Jeff started talking about him and Stephen being Southern, the G dropped off the back of all of his participles, which is, in fact, part of the story in and of itself. Thank you, sir. Okay, next, Michael or Louise.
Yeah, I can. I got to know, I'll start by saying, first of all, it was a shock for me and for everybody. Clearly, you saw the outpouring of comments on the internet from thousands of people who, including his brother, who started responding to messages, which I thought was really interesting too. And so he felt a part of the community, and he felt close enough through Stephen, I guess, to the community to actually write personal messages back to people. I thought that was really nice. But I got to know Stephen, funny enough, I guess it started probably, maybe a year and a half ago. As you know, my favorite place to sit at these conferences. And so I'm like sitting staring at him. And I actually said to him once, I was like a Stephen Harrison groupie, because I was like always sitting in the front row. And with some of the conferences, he'd be at like 6 different presentations. And every time I'd be sitting there looking at him, I go, this is a little weird, but it was really great. I, like Jeff, I did a number of video webinars with him also, including he was on the faculty for our second Muscle to Mash Primary Care Summit. I think I'll say my regret first. He said he was going to sign the book that Naim and he put out, and I forgot to bring it to the last meeting. And so I didn't get that signed by him, unfortunately. And so, that kind of bummed me out that I didn't have that, because that would have been a nice memory from him for that. But I think I don't know if it's a funny story, but I did a video interview after, I think it was Mosaic, and I was talking to him about the meeting, and I was having problems with the audio on it. And I said, after he went on for like 5 minutes talking about it, I said, Steve, we're going to have to do that again. And he just kind of looked at me like, because he was really busy running around from the meeting, and he's like, okay. And he just did the whole thing all over again, which was kind of cool. So anyway, I'll miss him as well. And thanks for the opportunity to share some of that.
Okay. Thank you, Mike. Louise, we're going to be doing this a few times in the next few weeks, but go ahead.
Yes. Well, where do I start? But yeah, it's hard. I spent over 3.5 years seeing him every week. I didn't think it was going to be this hard, but I knew it was going to be hard. But, in different homes, in different houses, in different rooms, different bottles of wine. I never got to have that deep fried turkey. So if anybody's got the recipe, please share.
It's not a tough recipe, Louise. We'll find you one.
But I suppose mine is the ability for him to relax on a beach with a load of sandcastles. And these weren't just any sandcastles. He did massive sand sculptures. And I think the ones he shared were Volkswagen Beetles and things like that. So this was a man who ran around the world, changed fatty liver disease. He definitely left a dent in it, and relaxed with his family, building sandcastles. Sometimes you just can't take the child out of the adult. So I'd send him a few sandcastle sculpture photos across the internet from here in Perth and that when they built them at Christmas to give him some inspiration. But yeah, it's hard.
Very. So everyone knows we don't have this podcast without Stephen, but I'll share an impression, a Stephenism, and then the moment in the last week that really knocked me out. The impression was the first time I met Stephen, or actually it was the first time I engaged this community. It was NASH-TAG 2019 in Park City, and I know nothing about fatty liver disease. I'm invited to give a speech. I have to read. I have to study. And I go, I know none of the characters. And there's this big guy, 6'3", 6'4". He's like popping up and down off the stage, kind of a little bit like a demented stork, except slightly more coordinated than that, but up and down and everywhere. And you could just feel Stephen's energy suffuse a room that was full of talent and full of intellect, but the energy was just different. And with the energy went everything that we're all going to be talking about as we talk about Stephen over the next few weeks. But my Stephenism for the day was he used to talk about, thank goodness they didn't stop after WD-39. Because for those of you who don't know the story, WD-40 was the 40th time they tried to do the lubricant. And in hindsight, I'm thinking of resmetirom as WD-40 in Stephen's life. That we did a project 4 years ago to figure out, I did a project for him 4 years ago to see what people thought about different folks and their ability to drive clinical trials forward. And the concern about Stephen was that he was so optimistic that could he ever get it right because he was just too optimistic? Obviously not, because the WD-40 actually has Stephen's fingerprints all over it, and that's a fantastic thing. The moment that crushed me, and Jeff, please forgive, this is a northerner to a southerner, okay? For those who know American history, our most troubling moment was the U.S. Civil War. And the hero of the Civil War, if you come from my part of the country, was the President of the U.S., Abraham Lincoln, who was assassinated very, very shortly after the South surrendered to the North. And the poet Walt Whitman wrote a poem about being in the North after the Civil War was over and Lincoln was dead, called "Oh Captain, My Captain." And I hadn't thought about this poem in forever. Scott Friedman posted it on LinkedIn as his tribute to Stephen, and I just lost it. It was that moment. And it's a shame that he will not be with us to celebrate everything that his energy, his passion, and his optimism have brought. But he was with us to see resmetirom get over the line and to declare in EASL and ASLD meetings that this is the promise we've been looking for. That's not enough, but it's going to have to be, because that's all there is, right? That he'll get to see. Now, let's take a deep breath. I will tell the audience before we get started that next week's episode will be a tribute to Stephen with some of his friends from the professional community. We're still seeing who we can pull together. And then we're going to be doing a much more extensive memorial to Stephen than that on the webpage over time. I'll talk more about that as we go along. But for now, let's just shift into our episode. Everybody take a deep breath, dry your eyes, and Groundbreaker. One good thing, personal or professional, that happened in the past week, if you can come up with one. If no one can come up with one, I will declare this a Groundbreaker-free week. But Louise, go ahead.
I'm back in Perth with my husband, so that's my positive.
Yep. That's good.
Well, I'll jump in. I know y'all, I'll spare you the dramatics of yesterday's great NASCAR race in Dover, because I don't know how much more I can handle from y'all on that. The thing that I have is actually something I'm looking forward to this week, which is yearly I participate in a charity event in West Virginia that helps raise money on river conservation out there. There's a river called the Cheat River, which is known colloquially as a dead river, meaning nothing grows in it. And that's largely from runoff of manufacturers and coal mines and whatnot in that area. And so there's a real effort, and the local community kind of comes together for once a year event to help celebrate. And there's all sorts of things that go on over the weekend as well. And so I really look forward to this weekend, because it's an area of the world that's in dire need of resources, in need of support, and frankly, just in need of a good time, to be able to be happy, to be able to have a community event built around it as well. And so I always look forward to this. Y'all may remember years ago, Jamie Oliver came into this section of West Virginia to try to do some good and was met with more than a little bit of controversy around it as well. But this has been a sustained, we're going into our 30th year of this event. And it's awesome. It's a great time. It's a good charity, good effort, and good people that are coming around to help support this local community in West Virginia.
Okay, Mike.
I went back and forth to talk about something that happened or was going to happen, but I'll just say this, because we have still so much work to do in this field that we're in. And I'm really excited to go on Wednesday night to Barcelona for the SLD think tank. There's about 75 thought leaders from around the world getting together to talk about action priorities. We do a lot of education. I would like to be more in a lot of ways like GLI and make actual change, like policy changes and things like that too. So that's going to be a really good meeting, because it's based on the publication that a lot of specialists were part of, that was like an action priorities focus on global action agenda, it was called, in hepatology. I'd love to, we talked about that a little bit before, Roger, then we can share some of that back when we get back. That's pretty exciting stuff.
Actually, the episode we tape on May 13th and drop on May 15th, Mike, will be a review of SLD Think Tank with Jorn and Jeff and you and maybe one or two others. So we'll be doing that, and I'm very excited about it. Okay, that's a good one.
Yes, for sure.
Boy, I have a friend who started out in military, suffered fairly severe PTSD, came back and became a folk singer and became a rocker, and recorded a few albums. She's spent the last 13 years until last week touring in the Summer of Love show as Janis Joplin. She has the voice to do it. And she came to New Hope and played a concert for a small group of us on Saturday night. And it was wonderful. Afterwards, a bunch of people where she grew up, which is about 30 miles from here, came to hang out. And watching the rapport between these people and the way they just sucked us literally right into their conversation, it was just a great night to remember how wonderful people can be. And these, Jeff, are northern country folks, but they are country folks. This is rural Hunterdon County, New Jersey we're talking about. So none of us city slicker crap here. It was all the real thing. A lot of question about could you eat steak if your friend ran the heating oil company and was charging you full price to heat your house? That kind of thing. That's the best I'm going to do right now. So why don't we just get started? I want to turn the floor over to Jeff and talk a little bit about the theme of Global Fatty Liver Day 2024 and kind of how you got there.
Well, I want to say that I think that this is a great time of transitions in respect to the honors and the remembrances going out for Stephen right now. There has been a nomenclature change, and so we are reflecting that. What we were talking about in terms of Global Fatty Liver Day used to be International NASH Day, and so it's now Global Fatty Liver Day to be a little bit more inclusive and surrounding of more of the patients and more of the disease states. So when we think of kind of the transitions, what is most needed in terms of fatty liver disease and where the priorities are, that's a great, honest conversation, I think. Now that we have arrived at a medication which is helpful, but not a panacea. For us, our goal and the thing that we have arrived at for our theme this year is basically to act now and get screened. When you look at the efforts around Rezdiffra, or what was resmetirom at the time when they were going for their approval, one of the things that they talked about with the FDA quite a lot, or that was talked about around the FDA, is kind of narrowing that patient population to specifically get at patients in the system. That's what it was. This wasn't going to be trying to address other early F2 necessarily or decompensated cirrhosis, but we needed patients in the system to be able to help them with that. And so for us, our question then becomes, how can we get more patients in the system? How can we screen? How can we get folks aware of their liver health more aggressively? And how do we do it in a coordinated global effort? So often we see these sort of patchwork initiatives come up. The community organizations do great things. Some of the national groups do great things. But in order for us to truly holistically attack this disease, we need to move on from just having one medication for one aspect of the disease state in one country and begin to really screen people to be able to address the issues that lay before us in terms of patient access and kind of set the ground, if you will, for other countries and other at-risk populations. So this year, Global Fatty Liver Day, go get screened. That's the thing.
Excellent. So one question that comes to mind is we've done a fair amount on this podcast over the last couple of years about the whole idea of clinical care pathways. But we had a couple of episodes earlier this year where we asked treating physicians how many up referrals they'd gotten from PCPs based on FIB4s, and the answer was universally zero. Now, I think part of that's because we didn't have a drug. But even with the drug, if you look at the groundwork that Madrigal needs to do for Rezdiffra, it doesn't have a lot of room in it right now for getting people into the top of the funnel. Michael, I'm guessing that's going to be one of the things that comes up. And did you like the way I did that without a G on the end, Jeff, guessing? That's going to be one of the things that comes up in Barcelona, the specific question of how to drive the top of the funnel.
Well, one of the topics, I just looked again this morning, it's the diagnostic gap, including AI, the use of AI, but it's availability, which I know Louise is focused on quite a bit too in her area, is the availability of the tools to be able to do those assessments, not just the biomarkers in some places like Canada that you still can't even get that unless you pay for it, but even the availability of things like FibroScans or other VCTE methods.
So, Jeff, I guess a part of my question then becomes, as a patient-centered organization, how much do you see of the work as being to get patients to get themselves screened versus working with the other stakeholders to make sure the prior conditions are there for all that to go right?
Oh, that's always a tough question for me, Roger, because I think my gut instinct, and this is just my reflex on that, is every time I feel like that question comes up, what I hear, and I don't think you're doing this, I'll say, but what I hear when I hear that coming from medical societies or from clinicians is, why can't patients just pull themselves up by their own bootstraps and go in and make it happen? And I think there are too many systemic sort of firewalls that still exist. That is not to deny patient accountability in terms of we can do a better job. We can do a better job as a patient organization. And this conversation is a part of that. But I find it to be a little off-putting in how much finger pointing goes on in the field of, well, if primary care did better at this, or if the endos did better at this, or if we had a diagnostic that could serve all the disease states and the FDA could come along and do their thing, without really focusing on the steps that we could take in order to support that. I think in order for primary care to do this, for instance, for patients to be more assertive and get screened, we as a collective, as a field, are going to have to hand that process to them turnkey. We've got to make it easy. This doesn't really exist in the medical field in general in many ways. There's some places where we've had big breakthroughs. I'm thinking, insulin, for instance. But even in the case of insulin, we still have roadblocks that come up. We still have issues with that. And so for patients to truly be able to get that service, to make it easy, we've got to do it at primary care for them in order to be referred to the specialist. I don't think Rezdiffra is going to be something that is seen in the primary care setting very much, but our hope for Rezdiffra was often not the medication itself, but in terms of the doorways that it could open. And that's the place where we are right now. And that's where we need the coordination and the better effort, is to make sure that we open those doorways so we can have the conversations about screening, for instance, getting more patients in the system, about reimbursement, about payers, about all these sort of things. And then as we're doing this here domestically in the US, how can we be setting the stage for if and when this happens with the EMA? And so as we've done this is kind of a templating exercise almost. So we've got, a handful of other therapies that are in phase 3 right now. So hopefully once we're able to sort through and troubleshoot all of this, then we can come back and it'll be easier for these other therapies to be able to make their way forward as well. And that includes, the combination aspect. I don't think they cite on the label for Rezdiffra that it should be used in combination with nutrition and physical activity. So what are the firewalls there that we need to go through? Our exercise specialist reimbursed? The field needs to be able to be available. That's not just something of pitching to the patient of saying, you ought to get up and get screened and get some exercise and eat better. We have to turnkey hand this to them. And that is the responsibility of the field here.
Jeff, I want to, I don't know if I'm calling you out or if I'm misreading something you're saying in there. I agree with 95% of what you said. I do think that it has to be a collaborative effort between patients and their primary care. I do think that, especially now, patients that are struggling with obesity and do have type 2 diabetes should say to their doctor at their next annual, if the doctor doesn't bring it up, hey, I'm at risk for this thing called fatty liver disease. They're not going to say steatotic liver disease, and I want to be assessed for that. I think it's on them to say that if the doctor doesn't bring it up, because it could be years until the doctors find the interest or the time to fit that into their agenda of meeting patients, because they have their 5 minutes that they have, right? So if that's what you're saying, I want to at least just add that I do think it's important for patients to have that ownership.
I totally agree with that, Michael. You're never going to have an argument from me that patients need to be more aware of their liver and educated about the liver. And I do think it's a fairly symbiotic relationship between the patients and whatever medical practitioner they're seeing, whether it's primary care, whether it's a specialist of some sort. They need to be able to have the resources and the support also so they can then be better prepared to ask the correct questions in this one.
Couldn't agree more with that. I'm going to hearken to two notes, however, Jeff, that first of all, I did not intend the question in any way to put it on patients. Okay. In fact, one of my real concerns is that patients will get activated into a system that isn't ready to absorb them, and that will present a ton of its own challenges. So I'm going to channel my inner Naim Alkhouri for a moment. And Naim has come on the podcast twice in the last 6 months and expressed the same concern. Louise, help me if I get this wrong, that if in fact too many patients go into primary care, we're going to wind up getting a bunch of false positive FIB4s that push patients onto hepatologists. And then most of those patients will screen out. They'll go back to primary care. Primary care will say, this isn't working. And hepatologists will say, I'm getting swamped for nothing. And that's because we've done a really good job of activating patients into a system that isn't ready to accept it yet. Louise, did I do okay with that?
Yeah.
All right.
That was exactly it. Is what we're going to do with them was the general impression.
Yeah, so that's number one, right? And then number two is where Jeff went, which is an American issue, Mike, admittedly, but it's real, which is that if people don't get properly reimbursed, then patients are going to be putting money out of pocket for no reason, or doctors are going to be eating money for no reason, or both. So I think we're still at a point where maybe there's a foundation and a frame for the treatment process, And what the res differ approval means in part is someone's going to spend a lot more money to build the house than they would have otherwise. But we've got to floor it. We've got to roof it. We've got to do all of it. I guess, so Jeff, part of my question to you becomes, you're certainly not spoiled for lack of opportunity or lack of targets. But do you or any of the three of you see one or two particular targets that patients can influence that will have the greatest positive throw weight on pushing this whole thing forward?
Off the top of my head, to me, it's getting screened. I mean, I'm coming back to that, but getting into the system proves that there's the need, and having the liver identified within that system is going to prove that there's a need there in that. It seems to me that we have concerns over theoretical issues right now, whereas we have very real issues in the moment. That we know upwards of 1 in 3 to 1 in 4 people have fatty liver disease globally, but that's not diagnosed. That's a projected number that we have on that. And so we need to have better real numbers of people that are actually with fatty liver disease. And then that way we can also get a better idea of the scan of fatty liver disease, of where these patients should live within their own health systems as well. For me, we got to get them screened.
I would add, Jeff, maybe you can elaborate a little bit, but I know that the Fatty Liver Foundation is doing a survey with patients to learn more about their knowledge levels and that as well. So some of that might help in the findings identify focus areas, right?
Yeah, absolutely. This could be kind of a tricky couple of years, or it's going to be a tricky couple of years as well, because we know the correlation with, obesity and fatty liver disease. And while we're having this conversation about drug development, about medication development, about reimbursement, there is that same very high level, very detailed conversation going on with the anti-obesity medications as well. One of them just recently got indicated for cardiovascular disease. And so I think there is a question of, in the same way that some are concerned that having a medication will lead to a sudden decline in the numbers of patients that are willing to sign up for clinical trials, I think there is also some concern that if we have anti-obesity medications that are moving forward, will there be the need for the early stage fatty liver disease medications? Granted, some of them are the same, but the distinction there is that we lose the focus on the liver, I guess, a little bit. And now some may say by any means possible, but we do have to be a little more intentional in terms of how we are going about this, I think.
Louise, please share general reactions or take us to either the other side of the pond or the other side of the world, depending on which of you two residences we're talking about. And how does this look different there, since this is, in fact, a global Fatty Liver Day and a global set of issues?
I think the guys all raised absolutely valid points throughout. One thing that drives attention is when people front up at primary care in numbers saying, I have this, I want this. And awareness is absolutely key. Liver disease is a small portion of poor liver health. We have had, on the whole, for the majority of patients, an awful long time of poor liver health. So we now need to start recognizing what poor liver health, for me, is driving. Poor liver health is driving cardiovascular disease. We have FIB4 also being attached to cardiovascular risk. We also know that poor liver health is accountable for up to 69-70% of those who develop type 2 diabetes. Some of those will have liver disease, end-stage HCC with that. The same in the cardiovascular community. So for me, it is screening for a different reason. It is screening to identify poor liver health as a driver of multiple other diseases, some of which are the biggest killers in the world and are part of a liver poor health syndrome. Now, that is a disease. Because it's not fibrosis does not mean it's not disease. And I think we have to broaden our net to say that we are screening you for liver health to reduce your cardiovascular and find where your liver disease is. Because if we've screened that volume of people to identify their risks, then we will find liver disease. At the moment, we're never going to find it in the volumes that we want. But I can assure you from my figures here in Australia and my data in the UK, some of which I'm going to talk about when I'm at EASL, is that at least 33% of the Australian population who think they're fit and healthy have fatty liver. Very few of them have liver disease. So the screening for liver disease question is poor. All of them were women who had advanced fibrosis, and most of those women were postmenopausal. So again, these are smaller numbers, but these are general population. These are not enriched populations. UK data, almost identical. If I subcategorize into the smaller figures, the ethnic minorities and the populations within the country, I've yet to find somebody from Nepal who doesn't have fatty liver. I've yet to find the majority of Indians who in either country who don't have an element of or a family history of. So I think there are significant pockets within that we know when we enrich those populations, that data. But I think there's a real element of giving people responsibility for health and saying, I've heard about this condition, I want to be screened for it. But if we just go, we know that patients tend to go to the GP, I think it's 2 to 5 times before somebody starts to screen their liver and think about livers. They attend on more average because their symptoms are so non-specific. But go into that, that's a policy decision. That's a countrywide decision to raise the level of poor liver health and liver disease affecting X, Y, and Z. So that also has to come into it. FIB4, if every GP had access to FIB4 or the ELF, we would then still be needing a second degree test in the community, which we don't have, to screen them out for the Naims and everybody else to enrich that population a little bit more strength. And I think we're starting to bring that in the UK with access to FibroScan in community care. The difficulty with that, there's no funding given to primary care to do this. There is no reimbursement system that is open for the next 2 years to allow somebody like ourselves to go on to be contracted in to just provide you with 14 scans once a year because you don't have the finances to buy a machine, train staff, and all of the other issues. And what we're seeing is this whole taking on the world by hepatology and specialist units with stretched staff who are under capacity for the work that they are doing, trying to think how they're going to deliver all of these services in the community. They don't need to. There's a lot of providers being set up to try and help, but we have as many barriers getting in to the system to try and support and give it better access to community diagnostics and better blood tests than there are as many coming out. So we really do have to think smarter to deliver smarter. Every point raised has been absolutely fabulous, and it is wonderful to see this spreading around the world and people raising the same issue. But unless you've got it on Medicare, unless you've got access to it, and unless you get the right blood tests to actually start to stratify at all, it's going to be very, very difficult.
Louise, you didn't mention today, and I love the points that you raised for sure, what's happening right now. What you didn't raise, which is a benefit that you've shared before, is the educational opportunities with patients when they see the liver scans and being able to monitor their progress as a goal, right? I don't know, maybe if you want to elaborate a little bit on your findings from that.
Yeah, we do patient questionnaires. It's part of the CQC thing. We need to get feedback on our services, what patients like, what patients don't like. And I've always found it far better to look at the complaints of a service. When I was a matron in the Excel Centre, I wasn't worried about all of the ticks that our service of vaccinations was perfect. It was the comments at the end of the suggestions, the real things that people wanted to see that were different or where they were positive. That's how we were able to change the service to work it better. 92% of everybody we engaged with who've sent the questionnaires back, and this is across enriched populations as well as non-enriched, have said that the use of FibroScan will help them make changes to their lifestyle and better make decisions. 7% then, further 7% said they thought it might. So it was maybe it will change. And only 1% of patients said none, it won't. So when you have a diagnostic device put into the hands of a skilled practitioner that can talk liver health quickly and non-discriminatory, because we don't discriminate what you've come in with, we just scan the liver and then we talk about what we find. But if you can say that 99% of people are affected by what they see and what they engage with in that room, then you are talking about one of the best devices to educate. But it can't be do the scan now and educate in 6 weeks when you see somebody for the results. It's got to be in that room at the time when they say, oh, I've got a bit of fat in my liver. What can I do about that? Because I don't want increased risks for heart attacks. It runs in the family or blah, 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 blah. So it opens up a whole new conversation. And then you can tweak out alcohol, food, high sugar fructose, all those things. Everybody has a little sneaky treat and they smile when they go, oh, I know what I've just done. And I said, what did you just think about there? Because that smile tells me you know what what it is. And it's funny.
Yeah, Roger expressed one of the concerns that's shared, and Jeff knows it also, that if too many patients are identified quantify what it's going to do to the system. But at the same time, if you're using the clinical care pathways, not everybody's going to be referred anyway. And the people that do have a liver health assessment, even if they're not referred, that is something that can be done to help other than just say diet, exercise. This is an internal driver that is really needed. I had that 319 CAP score, even though I didn't have fibrosis. I got, holy, you know what? I said, I got to do something about it. And it actually, like a year later, you can make a difference if you try. And, you know, you just shared some of the reasons that it doesn't work always, but at least people know what they're doing.
If it doesn't work, though, you then go to the next step and we look for reasons it doesn't work. That could be genetics. That could be medication that we can't change. For a long time, methotrexate, and the school's still out on whether or not it does do damage or doesn't do damage. And certainly at Imperial, all of our consultants from dermatology and rheumatology referred anybody being considered for methotrexate to check the underlying liver health. Because if we can alter your diet to help you stay on the best medications for your condition and your lifestyle, then that maximizes your health around a condition that you've got. And we see multiple patients who've been cured of hepatitis C, particularly if you're genotype 3 and an Indian ethnicity, develop fatty liver following hepatitis C treatment and eradication. So it's not that you can just discharge these people. Sometimes they go on to have different forms of poor liver health that could still drive disease. So it's a more general awareness of liver health rather than But as GPs hear more people say, I think I might want to be screened for this. I've got type 2 diabetes, I've got hypertension, I've got high cholesterol. Then they might start to go, oh, well, we'll start to ask those questions. So chicken egg scenario in some extent, but GPs respond to what comes through the door, particularly in a lot of countries. That drives what they're going to do next. And doing that is key for me, that education.
So for those who don't know our friend, Mr. McIntyre and his variety of facial takes, you just did 3 in a row in about 6 seconds. Could you please let us know what was flashing through your brain? If it had anything to do with what Louise was saying, if not, you keep it to yourself.
I should work on that for our audio audience. Perhaps it's good to...
Certainly for your poker game, pal. I'll play poker with you anytime you do that.
It's good to know where the strengths are.
I don't play poker, but I'd play poker with you.
It's so interesting to hear this conversation because I feel like what Louise and Michael have just done is give a really great synopsis to challenges and barriers for patients to get diagnosed and get care. And I'm thinking now also about, if you will, the back end of that once there has been diagnosis and care, how do we then prep for better patient access globally, not just in terms of diagnostics, but in terms of treatment, in terms of medication, kind of in terms of a solution for every stage, if you will. And that seems to me to be where the real power of Global Fatty Liver Day can be, is to have that coordinated global sort of messaging around this. And so we're getting ready to release our very first best practices and liver health policy report in Geneva in coordination with the WHO's World Health Assembly. And in that, one of the things that we do is we take a look at, well, what has worked well in, say, the Philippines? Could we transpose that to Ecuador? We know that there are things that have worked really well in India, for instance, and Egypt. And so what are the lessons learned? We can do that. And so we've got to be able to be intentional about both sides of this, that it's not just diagnosis, but also ensuring that there is follow through, that there's patient access, that we have kind of the system and each of the countries set up for success down the road as we see things like medication and better research and science on diet and physical activity. We need to have that kind of holistic global attitude because, as Louise mentioned, if this ends up just being sort of a compartmentalized sort of thing, then I don't know that we've done a lot of good on this. If we only can do this for folks that can pay out of pocket and can afford the personal trainer, we haven't really addressed those most in need in the worst case scenarios on this.
By the way, Jeff, not either those most in need or most of those in need. It works either way. We're not going to hit anywhere near a significant proportion of the world's population that needs help. The first time we had Jeff Lazarus on here 3 years ago, maybe, one of the things that he was talking about in terms of sustainable goals was the idea that people needed parks where they could walk, play, exercise, and feel safe.
Yeah, absolutely.
We tell people to exercise or physical activity and then put them in a lifestyle and environment where they can't safely do that.
You got it. There's so many variations of impacts that different things can have have on this. I think I've often admittedly idolized, say, Scandinavian pedestrian infrastructure. Talk about a nerdy thing. I feel like they've got their bicycling and their pedestrian infrastructure set up in ways that we dream of in North American cities. It would just be ideal. And we see that as like, oh my God, we could resolve so many things with that. But in so many of those countries, you introduce alcohol into the equation. And so they may not have the fatty liver numbers that the U.S. or that, some of the other Western nations have outside of that. But once you address alcohol, which is a very particular, characteristic for them, then you see those fatty liver numbers just go off the charts in that. And so there's some good stuff we can learn from that, I think.
Oh, I think you're right. It has to be a tier system. Some things will work in some countries. Some things won't work in countries. Most people affected are poor, low, and middle income countries where they're not going to get access to these medications. They're not really going to get access to liver biopsy or any of the expensive tests. And they run such risks, particularly in these countries, that we need access to non-invasive technologies. So if you can change behavior in Bangladesh, Rwanda, Kenya, and places like that on non-invasive technologies and do the monitoring with little cartridges, small amount of blood, gives you what you need in countries that are high endemic for hepatitis, and they drink alcohol, but they also have access to high sugar foods. And Africa is now one of the fastest growing areas for fatty liver. We still may not be on the scale of some of the concentrated populations that we talk about, Middle East, Hispanic, India and Asia, but there are countries in need where to be put on a medication for diabetes can send a family into poverty. Poverty in a family at that level means that you see increase in child trafficking. You see all of the other social determinants. So we need to be protecting these people and these countries in sustainable ways with the use of the technologies that we've got. And I think that is one of the goals that I had with Towers and Health, that everybody should know their liver health because it can actually prevent things like that. And then we can talk about the Western nations with resmetirom, resdifera, but when that comes to Australia, we've got no way to detect it. FibroScan was the one that was used, MRIF, PDAFF and things like that. And we've got access to those technologies. We need to build our systems better to support our populations, but the populations most in need going forward are the ones who can't get access to this. So I think it is a tiered system. So for you learning from these systems to be able to look it out is absolutely wonderful. But there are basics that we can all do. We can all have the same FIB4 test. We can all have those things. But if you forget an AST in the UK of a blood test, it costs you another £70 just to put that one test on against the £69 for all of the others together. If you put them together, it's just a no-brainer. It's sad, but it's a no-brainer.
I saw a study the other week that talked about the dramatic increase in childhood muscle and MASH around the world, really, but that one of the best predictors is food insufficiency. So exactly the people you're talking about, Louise, the ones who can't get access to the tests are the ones who are most likely to have the problem. They're most likely to have the problem because their diets don't support the kind of nutrition and health that makes it easy to get your calories in a healthy way. And if you drop on top of that system a diabetes drug, all you've done is made the problem worse. There's a real web here, right?
Louise reminded me of something. I find it poetic, frankly, at this point, because it is a thing that a year or two ago I actually had a little bit of a reference with Stephen Harrison about, which is he and I talked about briefly. I asked him if he had ever heard of a thing called the Stockdale paradox. And he had. He knew it well. And it's something that's taught quite often. And y'all may remember, especially Roger and I as the two Americans, back in the day when Ross Perot ran for president, that he nominated for his vice president somebody named James Stockdale, Admiral James Stockdale at the point. And there was a great viral moment back when viral was defined by being on the evening news of Stockdale standing up at the podium for the vice presidential debate going, "Who am I? Why am I here? Nobody knows who I am." Stockdale, which the Stockdale paradox is named after, was a prisoner of war in Vietnam, I believe, for roughly about 7 years. And they asked him at one point, "How do you do it? How do you keep going?" And what was named is, he said that you have to have a faith in the long term, in the big picture, that things are going to work out, that there is going to be a Stephen Harrison sort of optimism about what is going to happen. But the paradox of that is that you also have to get busy with the things right in front of you. And so you can't be just so caught up with the big picture that you just kind of think things are going to be okay without putting the work in on the immediate steps. And that's what comes to mind when Louise talks about kind of addressing these sort of things. I mean, we go very quickly from we need to get people screened from fatty liver disease to child trafficking. That's in many ways, we acknowledge the downstream impacts, but that's trying to boil the ocean when the ocean is large and our boat is small. And so where can we direct that boat for the most impact in this moment? And that was the promise in the US for the medication that came forth, that we could begin to have these battles. And we saw those battles behind the scenes happening. We saw behind the scenes that when the VA came out with their draft prescription benefits manual, for instance, after Rezdiffra was approved, that they still required biopsy for diagnosis in their draft. And that was a problem. And so we, GLI, mobilized and got in touch with our friends on the Capitol Hill. They got in touch with people at the VA, and we were able to have that revised. But that's a great indication of, wow, if there had still been a loophole for biopsy that was necessary for diagnosis from a government agency that contradicted another government agency's kind of guidelines, then when we get our next therapy through and approved, then we still got that loophole that we've got to deal with. We just don't know where it's going to pop up, as opposed to kind of this great way we're going to have. And I'll mention also finally here one thing, that when we talk about, the impact of nutrition, the impact of food, right now at the USDA here in Washington, there is a consideration for revising the definition of the word healthy as to be used in packaging and as it applies to any food product that's given in the West. And we know that there's a huge trickle-down effect when it comes to other countries in the way it's done here. And there are companies, they are big, multinational, multi-billion, trillion-dollar companies that are actively lobbying and are on record of saying that added sugar needs to be a part of that definition. And they are making a quote-unquote scientific argument that added sugar is actually good for you and good for children. And they've got a lot of weight that they're swinging in order to make this happen. And so big ocean, small boat, we're going to do the things right in front of us. Let's get people screened.
It's interesting you say that. There was a big to-do in the UK not so long ago about children's teeth and access to dentists, because the rate of decay in children's teeth is really high. Now, what we do know is that bad teeth, I think, confer a 7-fold increase in your risk of liver cancer, because we are picking out people who have bad diets. And if we put liver diagnostics in every dentist, we would probably find the majority of our poor liver health. They're going to be looking at these children. They're wondering all of these different things. They come from the usual suspects, more lower socioeconomic areas with access to fast food on their doorstep. But this population of children now need to be followed through life for their liver concerns, their risk of diabetes, their heart disease. We've identified them. We've been giving them access to dental care and dietitians. We need to be doing a little bit more. But if we look at the common threads for most of our diseases, if we strengthen our nutrition education, if we strengthen our dietetics in hospitals and access to GPs, if we give them better counsellors, most of our diseases all run around the same needs, rather than just keep it very siloed. This is my part of a dietitian. The dietitian could be wealthy across everybody's, and that's what we still see. It's a cardiovascular dietitian, or it's diabetes and liver can't have access. We've got to break down those type of barriers to improve the care of everybody. But I did a nutrition course. Fatty liver wasn't really mentioned, so we need to start at the education of nutritionists and dietetics. We need to talk fatty. We need to bring the liver, as I say, my phrase is we need to write liver back into the story of our health, because wherever we've written it out, we have a serious problem. It's only going to increase unless we start to have that conversation.
I totally agree. What scares me, Louise, is it sounds sometimes not unachievable, but where do we start? It's easy to do something small. It's hard to do something, as Jeff said, you got the whole ocean. We're all looking at each other and going, okay, so who's going first?
It's like that program, Drain the Oceans.
Yeah.
I'll tell you what. You start small, not in hospitals. I had a friend who used to go, who I worked with in the Royal Prince Alfred, and he did archaeology in his spare time. And he went to Angkor Wat, and they did a project where they just taught some of the villagers to boil their water before they did the wound dressings and things like that, and basic hand hygiene. They cut diarrhea, they cut lots of spread diseases. They just taught something local that affected the women, the education of the children and their families in those villages, and it improves the health of those small communities. So sometimes we can look at a more local levels with something very simple to take ownership of if you've got a problem. At the moment, we're trying to change the world at a high level. High level never gets down to the ground floor. Trust me, I've worked in a hospital an awful long time to see that if you put the money in at the high level, I never see it where it affects patients. So I think we have to squeeze the lemon. And is the juice worth the squeeze? Because I am going to use a Stevenism here for that.
Okay, well, they've got to keep it simple, stupid. So one of the reactions I had, Louise, particularly listening to your last comment, is I think about the metaphor of the 6 blind people touching the elephant in different places, and they all describe it's a tusk, it's a this, it's a that. The number of people touching the elephant called steatotic liver disease is mind-boggling, right? I quote Jeff from time to time, or used to more than I do now, about the idea that in the end we're all treating liver cancer. And Jeff, the reason I stopped quoting is that in the end we're all treating extrahepatic cancers more than we're treating liver cancer. So we're just treating cancer, right? We're just treating heart disease. We're treating all of it. So the problem is, challenge is, opportunity is. Mike, I'm becoming more a pharmaceutical sales guy as I go through this. That's Mike's background for those who don't know. The opportunity is to help everybody see the elephant and then understand that you got to grab it by the tusk, or grab it by the trunk, really. And the trunk is screened. If you tackle every point on the elephant, you start clipping its nails and brushing its, you're just not going to get anywhere, right? But if people don't see that it's an elephant, then they're not going to know what to do anyway, or they're just going to touch the part they know.
And only having a pretty elephant's not going to do a lot. But yeah, you're right. If we go back to the basics in primary care and say, don't wait to rule the liver in, start by ruling it out. If you rule out liver disease, then focus on the next one. But always make that assessment and do not use liver blood tests. Use something more indicative, I suppose. And I don't know what non-invasive device you want to use, whether or not it's FibroScan and VCTE. It is purely, we pick up a liver in poor health. It's up to somebody else to know what that health is, whether or not it's abnormal inflamed liver tests, whether or not there's actually a disease process under there, whether it's just simple fat throwing things off, or whether or not those tests are absolutely normal. If we pick up a liver that needs a further assessment, then it's going to get that assessment. And it's got to be achievable, it's got to be cheap enough, and it's got to be accessible. And at the moment, in no healthcare system that we work in, is it any of those for any liver test. But we've got to start thinking, let me just rule the liver out, and then I can focus on what I think it really is.
So, Louise, I start thinking to myself that rule the liver out is the professional equivalent of get screened. Right? That what the patient has to do is put themselves in front of the doctor and have the liver evaluated. And what the provider, not just doctor, the provider then has to do is say, okay, I'm ruling the liver out. And those are 2 very simple places to start for 2 very different audiences. So, Jeff, I guess when I go back to my first question about what can you do? And you said people put it on the patient. No, I think we put it in different places. But those probably are the 2 most important messages, right? On the one hand, patient gets screened. On the other hand, doctor, rule the liver out. And if the patient comes and asks about the liver, definitely start on the liver. If you could just make those 2 changes, you'd be way ahead, right? Of course, it's not trivial. But
yeah, I couldn't agree more with that, Roger. I mean, the implications of what you and Louise and Michael are saying here are vast. You know, that it implies that there is awareness of the liver, there's awareness of liver health, it implies there's awareness of liver disease and downstream effects, it implies that there's awareness of screening. There are just so many good things that grow out of that, you know, so let's get screened and then for providers, rule the liver out for any indications it may have, or educate and treat the issues that may be there.
I agree. I think we've actually done a pretty good job of getting something really complicated to a really simple place, which circles back around to, okay, Jeff, now we get why you're doing it the way you're doing it. We're at the bottom of the hour, so we're close to the final question. But before I do that, I want to give Jeff and Michael in particular an opportunity each to talk about one specific initiative associated with Global Fatty Liver Day that you think an audience of doctors and patient advocates around the world would like to know about, or you'd like them to know about. Either way.
We're following up on a pilot that we've done a couple of times already, where we're going out to communities and doing a combination of education and just screening or assessing of liver disease in that community. Because, as Louise said, just sort of one step at a time too here, if we can get on the ground. And so we chose Calgary, Alberta for June 13th for Global Fatty Liver Day because it's really the most advanced clinic for MASLD and MASH in Canada. And we're going to have Dr. Mark Swain, who's the hepatologist, who's going to speak directly to the community community, and we're going to have the clinic nurse and a patient and myself, and we're shooting for 100 people. And I don't know how many we're going to have the time to scan, but we have the collaboration with KNS Canada and EchoSense, and so we'll have a technician and we'll have a fiber scan there at the event. So I already know we've done it twice, so this will work out well. The question is how many people can we get assessed, and also making sure they don't eat till after. that was my lesson last time. We were very nice. We had healthy food and everything, and then we realized that people were eating before the test. That probably wasn't the best move. So learn as you go.
I'll give you a clue, Michael. We do real-time scanning. I introduced that at Imperial, whereby you didn't fast people because they were coming for their appointments. They obviously forgotten. They didn't know. They weren't doing. We only had to recall 1 in 10. You only recall the ones with abnormal stiffness. If your stiffness is normal, having eaten, it's not a problem, really. The cap does not change. When we called back 100 people out of 1,000 that we scanned, the cap moves 0.04%.
Okay, that's good to know.
But yes, we saw the fall in kilopascals. So if in doubt, don't worry about them fasting or non-fasting. But if they're stiff, and particularly in the higher ranges, the 8s, the 9s and thing, then you recall them. They need repeat scans. But actually, 9 out of 10 of everybody coming in that door is not going to have a stiff liver. It is fatty liver you're looking for in the majority. Yep.
You know what? No, that's interesting. One of the smaller ones that we did, one of the first ones, was about 30 people from the community. We actually had 1 F2 and 1 cirrhotic. And this was not a focus like, if you have these risk factors come in, it was basically, we have this health education, assessment event. And 1 F2 and 1 cirrhotic, which is a lot, I think.
Yeah. So we know liver disease is actually small in the population. And at Lauren Castera, a lot of the work's been done that says that. But fatty liver is the biggest global problem. That doesn't necessarily mean it's liver disease. It's poor liver health. By finding it early and making that change, and that's the key. And the British Liver Trust, when they do their scanning, they don't fast people. They just walk in off the street. So I wouldn't focus on the fasting unless it's somebody with a medical condition.
No, because even at the other event, we had a Canadian liver meeting, and we had over 100 people that got assessed at this conference, and so they're all involved in medical. It was like, but over 60% had defined, a CAP scores that would be like fatty liver. So I'm totally with you. In fact, there was no fibrosis in that group at all, but there was a lot of fat.
And by not insisting that people fast, you can screen more people quicker because your conversations are quicker. And I think that's the key if we're talking about access to screening and what we're looking for.
And going back to our friend Stephen, Louise likes to use the KISS metaphor at least once a meeting, and we just hit it. Keep it simple, stupid. No reason to worry about whether they've eaten or not. Just screen them. How's that, Jeff? I didn't call anybody stupid. How's that, Jeff? Louise just made screening simpler by saying don't worry about what they've eaten that day.
Because we're not medically screening. If I was seeing them in clinic, yes, I request. So it's a different. Again, it's location. Out of those patients coming into the hospital, we were able to discharge over 30% on that one visit because they were seeing a specialist for the first time. Their liver health was fine on FibroScan. So we didn't need all of these other so we shorten the journey. And I think that's the key with healthcare. We can shorten the journey and keep the right people in community care. The more people with fatty liver in the community being looked after primary care, the more primary care will look for it because they can do it really well.
Super. Jeff, one activity you're aware of in particular that you'd like to share with our audience today, and then we're going to go to the final question.
Absolutely. I am tempted to say screening as well because this is the one time where we kind of see screening worldwide. Last year, we had an emphasis on physical activity with Step It Up as our theme, and we ended up with, I think our final numbers on screening were just over 77,000 people screened worldwide for fatty liver disease. And so the screening is always humbling to me to see the street teams in India and Bangladesh, to see the stuff that goes on in Australia, that goes on in the Pacific as well. It really is about the screening and this. To give you one thing, Roger, which I know you're asking for while watching the clock here a little bit, every year we have several panel discussions and we bring folks in to talk about different aspects of the disease. Our partners talk about what they're doing. We have an emphasis on obesity panel that we're going to be doing this year as well. Tons of digital components and whatnot. But every year I feel like Global Fatty Liver Day is the one chance for us as a community, as a field, as patients, and to step back and do kind of a state of the union or a state of the liver report. And so we will be doing that again this year. We'll be having a discussion on kind of the global state of fatty liver disease. Where are we now? Where are the priorities moving forward globally? How do we incorporate the need for more screening with the need for more access and more policy worldwide? What can we learn? That's really the big big thing for me. Global Fatty Liver Day is June 13th. And so in the midst of the conversation on the content, to make sure that people remember always the second Thursday in June, but on June 13th. And it's going to be a busy year because that's going to come on the heels of the World Health Assembly and on the heels. I'll be flying back from the EASL meeting just in time to be able to make it back for Global Fatty Liver Day here in the U.S.
That pretty well wraps up, right? I mean, Louise, are you familiar with any initiatives going on and specific initiatives going on in the UK or Australia you want to share?
Not that I'm aware of. I think there are some. I believe Australia are having a bit bigger part this year, which is wonderful. And having spoken to a few groups, but I'll let them share what they're doing. I know the British Liver Trust will be very focused on certain aspects of Global Liver Day. And they did a great thing with parliamentary debate, but they've already had that. I think that was last week.
Superb. So the only thing I will say in closing is that we are going to work over the next month to bring in advocates from different parts of the world to do one-on-one or one-on-two interviews with Louise and or me about exactly what they're doing in their parts of the world as part of this event. Jeff might be happy to share to interview people whose names you share because you think they're interesting things, and we're going to try to ferret out a few on our own. I will be back with a question of the week and a business report in just a few minutes. I want to thank everybody for being a part of today's conversation and look forward to seeing all you guys soon in different settings. Okay? Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Roger.
Thank you.
And now, here's Roger with this week's question of the week.
Here's our question of the week. On this week's episode, we discussed two short and sweet overarching themes for liver advocates to use as part of the Global Fatty Liver Day presentation or other relevant discussions. For the patient, from GLI, get screened now. For the provider, from Louise Campbell, rule liver disease out. In your own work, how can you bring either theme, get screened now, or rule liver disease out, to your target customer or stakeholder group?
And now for the Season 5, Episode 13 Business Report.
Slava Ukraini, glory to Ukraine, and also Am Yisrael Chai, the people of Israel live. Once again, American arms and support are flowing to Ukraine, if a few months later than it could have been. I read tremendous optimism that this will reverse the Russian advances and help the Ukrainian people return to the earnest, pivotal, and heroic task of repelling the attackers and moving democracy forward. As one story becomes a source for greater hope, another becomes a place where hope recedes. The levels of anti-Jewish activity seen on college campuses across the U.S. is multiply horrible. Americans, particularly but not solely American Jews, have long asked whether what happened in Germany in the 1930s could ever happen here. These early signs are terrifying for everyone who respects America's commitment to liberty and religious freedom. We all should do whatever we can to support the democracy and the pluralistic state in which we live. As for Israel, people are beginning to fear for how many of the Hamas hostages are still alive, and the Israeli government continues to operate in a controversial manner. Let us all pray. Charoyim Slava, glory to heroes, and also Am Yisrael Chai, the people of Israel live.
Our marketing campaign did not roll out last week.
Out of respect to Stephen Harrison's memory, we did not roll out the marketing campaign last week as promised. Those materials will start rolling out this week. In 2 weeks, I'll discuss it all further in the business report.
Our next 2 weeks' schedule is already filled in.
I've mentioned previously that we were planning to post an episode on May 15th following up on the SLD think tank taking place this weekend in Barcelona. Mike Betel, who's attending, actually discusses the think tank a bit in this episode. Next week, we will drop an episode on May 8th dedicated to Stephen's memory. Look for posts about this at the end of this week or early next week.
This spring, we plan to experiment with adding special extra episodes.
In addition to the weekly episode roster, we will be posting special extra episodes or conversations throughout the spring. Some will be interviews with patient advocates from specific countries, asking about Global Fatty Liver Day activities in their countries. Others will be part of what I anticipate will be a rolling tribute and memorial to Dr. Harrison. We will share more on this in our weekly newsletter, which launches this week.
Another country cracks the health and wellness top 250.
For the first time since late 2022, Tsunami has cracked the health and wellness top 250, a far tougher standard than the medical top 250 in Iceland, where it had been big in 2022, but then not in 2023. Let's keep building.
This week's vault comes from last year's International NASH Day coverage.
This week's vault comes from last June. As part of our coverage of International NASH Day 2023, our friends and patient advocates Gina Biliati-Madison from NASH Knowledge and Marco Korignac from the European Liver Patients Association joined Louise Campbell, Mike Betel, and me to discuss the 2023 event. Much of the discussion focuses on Louise's experience scanning members of the English Parliament, but be sure to listen at the end when each participant describes the activities they anticipate from their own organizations for 2024. You'll have to listen to determine how good their crystal balls were. Okay, that's it for this week. I want to thank our team, Bjorn, Louise, Mike, Eric, Steve, as we keep moving forward. Enjoy our upcoming conversation Saturday and Sunday. Please take a listen to our question of the week and, of course, reply. We'll be back next week with a special tribute to Stephen Harrison. Until then, stay safe. Surf on. Bye-bye now.
Have any questions for the surfers? You can send them to questions@surfingmash.com and we will answer on the podcast or website. Your question might even wind up being the question of the week.